Like what we're doing here at Cube for Two? Click the like and subscribe button to let us know. Also, Cube for Two is now a TCG Player affiliate. Click the link in the show notes for all your shopping needs to help support the channel. Alright guys, let's get started. What's good, Cubers? It's your boy Matt. It's that time. We got a new set coming out this weekend. Hopefully you got to pre-release safely at the house with your family on the kitchen table. But either way, we got new cube cards to evaluate. There's a bunch of them. Let's get started. First up is Bassariket. For 1 and double white, you get a 3 loyalty planeswalker. +1, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. It gains indestructible until end of turn. -2, whenever 1 or more non-token creatures attack this turn, create that many 1/1 white soldier creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. -6, you get an emblem. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Bassariket actually seems a reasonable tool for white weenie aggro decks. You can play him on turn 3 and plus him to put a 1/1 counter on your 1-drop or your 2-drop. You can play him on turn 3, swing in, having minus and make 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens tapped and attacking with them. So I actually think the card could be very serviceable in the white aggro deck in Cube. The floor aspect of him, though, is that he's terrible on an empty board. He has no way to make tokens on his own. He requires you to already have a board. And as a result, he may not be as effective as some of the other white weenie planeswalkers. Gideon doesn't require you to have a board and dodges sorcery speed board wipes like Wrath of God. I do like Bassariket better than Ajani because of his lower mana cost, although Ajani does have the ability to minus and return one of your guys from the graveyard to the battlefield. But if you're going for an all gases approach, Bassariket is probably better than Ajani, and if you're in a slower, grindier format, Ajani is probably better than Bassariket. Still, I am going to playtest this card. I think playing him on turn 3, swinging in with your 2 guys, minusing, making 2 more 1/1 white soldier creature tokens also tapped and attacking, is gonna feel pretty gross, and it gives Bassariket pseudo haste if he's actually able to make those creatures. I think Bassariket is actually one of the more impressive walkers in this set. But speaking of aggro, this is an aggro card. Seasoned Hallowblade. For 1 and a white, you get a creature human warrior 3/1. Discard a card, tap Seasoned Hallowblade. It gains indestructible until end of turn. So what we have here is a less self-destructive Adanto Vanguard. Adanto basically does the same thing. He's a 3/1 when he swings in, and you can give him indestructible. The cool thing about the Vanguard is paying for life is actually better for the aggro deck, because you don't care about your life, than discarding a card. Still, Seasoned Hallowblade being able to swing in and eat whoever blocks him is going to be fantastic, and it lets him dodge some of the board wipes in Cube as well. Seasoned Hallowblade is a fixed Adanto Vanguard, but I still really like this card. I think if you're in a peasant environment or even a tier 1 environment, Hallowblade is going to be worth trying out if you support White Weenie. Speaking of Bassariket, let's talk about his buddy. Bassariket's Lieutenant. For 3 and a white, you get a 3/4 human knight, vigilance, protection from multicolored. When Bassariket's Lieutenant enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control, which could include himself. Whenever Bassariket's Lieutenant or another creature you control dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. So I have to admit, when I first saw this card, I was really unimpressed. But the more I think about it, the more the card is starting to grow on me. Vigilance and protection from multicolored isn't nothing. Alright, there are plenty of multicolored removal spells or planeswalkers who bounce things to your hand or nerf stuff and turn it into food. I'm looking at you, Oko. But Bassariket's Lieutenant avoids all of that, and you can choose to put the +1/+1 counter on him, which makes him a 4/5. So the floor is you play a 4 mana 4/5 with Vigilance, protection from multicolored, and when it dies, it makes a 2/2 white knight, which gives you some value if the board wipe happens the turn after you play Bassari's Lieutenant, and maybe there's some incidental 2/2 white knights created based on some other counters you have, especially if you're playing the aforementioned Bassariket. Here's the thing, I don't think he's as good as the top tier 4-mana white creatures for the aggro deck or for the mid-range decks, but I think this creature is probably better than I give it credit. It's not Broodmoth Palace Jailer Hero of Bladehold good, but I think it slots in right under those guys, and I think it's a worthy include, especially if you're in like a tier 2 cube, if you're in a lower power cube. The more I look at it, the more Bassari's Lieutenant grows on me. I think the floor is a little higher than it looks to the naked eye. That being said, let's talk about another 4-drop. Let's talk about Mangara the Diplomat. For 3 and a white, you get a 2/4 human cleric with lifelink. Whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if two or more of those creatures are attacking you and or planeswalkers you control, draw a card. Whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, draw a card. I've seen some people really excited about this card on the Cube forum. Stop. Just stop. This is an EDH card. This card sucks. I'm not even sure how good it's going to be in EDH. Mangara is not cubable. Do not play this card. It's going to be really expensive, guys. Just save yourself the money. Did you just see the 4-drops that we were looking at? Do you know how big your cube would have to be to make Mangara any good? And it's this weird control card because you want your opponent swinging into you so you can draw, but it's a creature, so it's going to die to your board wipes. No. Let's move on to something better. Let's move on to something more loyal, something that'll stay with us, like the Pack Leader. Yes, who's a good boy? You are. Yes, you are. Pack Leader is 1 and a white for a 2/2 dog. He reads, other dogs you control get +1/+1. Whenever Pack Leader attacks, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn to dogs you control. Now, we're not playing Dog Tribal, so that first line is just flavor text. But that second line, though, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn to dogs you control. Pack Leader doesn't say other dogs. Pack Leader counts himself, which means you can turn him sideways fearlessly on turn 3, and the only way he's dying is if they have a removal spell. I actually think this is a reasonable 2-drop. I mean, he's not Thalia, Guardian of Thraben or anything, but the guy is actually playable, especially in lower power cubes. I think if you're looking to play 2-drops like Glory Bound Initiate, then Pack Leader is probably in the range you're looking for. I think he's very solid. He's not going to trade in combat. I like Pack Leader a lot, and I think if you are in a lower power environment, you will like him a lot too. That's a good boy. Go fetch their life points. Yes. Alright, let's keep going and move on to blue and talk about one of my favorite cards in the set, and that is Baron, Tolarian Archmage. For 1 and double blue, you get a 2/2 human wizard. When Baron Tolarian Archmage enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. At the beginning of your end step, if a permanent was put into your hand from the battlefield this turn, draw a card. So Baron is a take on a classic cube favorite called Lanoir. But there's a key difference. Baron will also let you bounce planeswalkers. So if your opponent is about to ult that walker, you can bounce it back to their hand. You can also bounce your own walker back to your hand if you want to replay it and reset its loyalty. Maybe you've played it and minused it a couple of times, and Baron will let you do that. Baron is pretty much a straight upgrade over Lanoir. The only difference is the double blue in his casting cost. I think that's going to be negligible. Most decks that play cards like Lanoir are a little blue heavy anyway. They're either blue tempo decks or they're blue control decks, and they're using him to just bounce something for the turn. I think Baron is a slam dunk in cube, and you're probably going to want to pick one up. Now let's take a look at a card that maybe isn't a slam dunk in cube and is giving me brain aneurysms on how good it might be, and that is Ghostly Pilferer. For 1 and a blue, you get a 2/1 Spirit Rogue. Whenever Ghostly Pilferer becomes untapped, you may pay 2. If you do, draw a card. Whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, draw a card. Discard a card, Ghostly Pilferer can't be blocked this turn. So this 2-drop is basically exclusively for the blue X tempo deck, right? He's your creature that you want to swing in, pop your opponent, and then on your next turn, untap, pay 2, and draw a card. If the board is clear the first time you swing the Pilferer, when you untap and pay 2 to draw, you're going to feel like a gangster. But unfortunately, I think most of the time you're going to have to discard a card so that he can't be blocked. And then when you pay 2, you draw a card on your next untap step, which makes him more of a rummage effect and less of a loot effect. I'm not sure how good he's going to be, although I can promise you this, he will wear swords and other equipment very well. I think once something is equipped on him, you won't mind discarding to give him unblockable, but the blue tempo deck really values its cards, and discarding them to make him unblockable only to have him die to some kind of removal effect is going to feel horrible. So I don't know, if you play cards like Warkite Marauder and Terramander, Ghostly Pilferer is probably worth testing in your environment because you're already supporting this blue tempo deck anyway. But Pilferer is not a card that's going to get splashed in other decks. The control decks aren't going to want him, the blue mid-range decks aren't going to want him, so he is exclusively for blue tempo. You know whether or not you want this card. Speaking of cards you may not realize you want, let's talk about See the Truth. For 1 and a blue, you get a sorcery. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of those into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. If this spell was cast from anywhere other than your hand, put each of those cards into your hand instead. So what See the Truth really is bad Anticipate, right? Anticipate, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, the rest on the bottom in any order. So it's the same effect, but Anticipate is at instant speed. So I can hear what you're saying, like, Matt, why wouldn't I just play Anticipate? You would. But if your cube is big and you need a higher density of quality cantrips, there's nothing wrong with adding See the Truth to increase your density. So don't just dismiss it out of hand because it's a sorcery. If your cube is larger, you will probably find See the Truth playable as added density for your blue decks. I think the card is actually kind of sort of fine. But let's move on to a card in blue that everyone is really interested in. Let's talk about Teferi, Master of Time. For 2 and double blue, you get a 3 loyalty Planeswalker Teferi because we don't have enough Teferis in the world. You may activate the loyalty abilities of Teferi, Master of Time on any player's turn anytime you can cast an instant. That still means you only get to do it once though, for those of you watching at home. +1, draw a card, then discard a card. -3, target creature you don't control phases out. -10, take 2 extra turns after this one. So here's the way Teferi works. You play him on your turn, you plus him to 4, and you draw a card and you discard a card. Then you go to your opponent's turn. If they're going to swing at Teferi, you can -3 him to phase out whatever they're swinging at, and if they don't, on their end step, you plus him to draw a card and discard a card, and now he's at 5. A brief word about phasing for those of you who didn't play Rainbow Efreet in your childhood. Phasing doesn't cause a creature to leave the battlefield, so if you phase out your opponent's creature when it phases back in, you won't get any ETBs. It never actually left the battlefield. Anyway, Teferi looks super busted in Commander, where you can plus it on each of your opponent's turns, and so by the time he gets back to you, he's at 7 loyalty, and then you can plus him during their turns again, and then minus him and take 2 turns on someone's end step. It's just gross in EDH. In Cube, it looks fine. I don't think it's a bad card by any stretch, but I don't think it's Jace the Mind Sculptor either. I think it's probably a fine 4-drop that you can play to get value off of, but it's not going to be nearly as broken as it is in a format like EDH. I'm actually not even sure how much standard play this Teferi is going to see. Either way, if you want to play test it, you can. I probably will, but I'm not going to be in a hurry to run out and pick one up either because the price on this card is going to be really, really high for just a cube card that I think is just going to be fine. I don't think it's going to be bad. You're welcome to play it. I think it'll be fine. But let's talk about the cantrip in this set I'm most excited to play. Let's talk about Waker of Waves. That's right, Waker of Waves as a cantrip. So Waker of Waves is 5 and double blue, 7 mana for a 7/7. Creatures your opponents control get -1, -0. Pay 2, 1 and a blue, pay 2. Discard Waker of Waves. Look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, put the other into your yard. that discard Waker of Waves, look at the top 2, one in your hand, one in your yard effect, that's awesome. And because it's a ability on the card, it can't be counterspelled. It's kind of like cycling, where you can discard him, get some card value, and now he's in your graveyard, which is fine, especially if you're in some kind of reanimate deck. It's one thing that Titanoth Rex has taught me since playtesting him in Ikoria. Cards that bend themselves, reanimate targets that bend themselves, are fantastic. So if you're supporting Dimir Reanimate, Waker of Waves is right up your alley. And if you're not, and you just need another cantrip, you can actually just play him as that. He's an uncounterable cantrip, right? You just discard him out of your hand. If you're hard casting this guy, you're doing it wrong. This card is not meant to be hard casted. The only thing I don't actually like about him as a reanimate target is he doesn't have a good way to close out the game. Titanoth Rex has Trample. Trample is great. It ends the game, even if your opponent blocks him. And Waker can just be chump blocked to death. I'm still going to try him because worst case scenario, he's a uncounterable cantrip, and he can be played at instant speed. But I think if you're in a lower powered cube that's trying to support Reanimate, Waker of Waves is exactly what you're looking for. This is actually the blue card I'm most excited to playtest. But speaking of blue cards, let's do a little math, shall we? Mana Leak plus negate equals Miscast. For 1 blue mana, you get an instant, counter target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 3. So what we have here is a cheaper negate that's conditional on your opponent paying 3 mana. But you know what I've learned about Mana Leak in Cube? That sucker is always turned on. So I actually think I'm going to play Miscast over Negate, at least for a little while, and see how much of a difference it makes. Negate being unconditional is nice, but I'm willing to bet that Miscast will get the job done almost just as often. Also, for those of you in Standard looking for a way to counter that turn 2 growth spiral, you're welcome. But let's keep going, and let's move to black, where we have a really interesting new removal spell, and that's Eliminate. For 1 and a black, you get an instant, destroy target creature or planeswalker with converted mana cost 3 or less. I am a big fan of any removal spell that gives players interaction with planeswalkers, and if you're running guys like, I don't know, Muyan Ling, Teferi, or Oko, Eliminate could be really strong inside your cube. I've actually done the math in my own cube, and there are 128 viable targets out of 216 total targets, which means that it'll handle roughly 60% of the threats in my cube, which means it's turned on quite a bit in the early game, but there's definitely some late game stuff it can't handle. If your cube is bigger, or your average CMC is lower, then Eliminate probably gets better for you. In my cube, I'm not really sure. I'm going to playtest it and try and figure it out. But like I said, anything that'll remove planeswalkers, for me, is worth giving a go. Speaking of planeswalkers, let's talk about the new black Liliana. Liliana, Waker of the Dead. For 2 and double black, you get a 4 loyalty Liliana. +1, each player discards a card. Each opponent who can't loses 3 life. -3, target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. -7, you get an emblem at the beginning of combat on your turn. Put target creature card from a graveyard on the battlefield under your control. It gains haste. So this Liliana is bad. She's bad. Here's the deal. Plussing to make everyone discard a card and an opponent who can't lose 3 life is very similar to the ability on Liliana of the Veil. So that part is okay. But the problem is that when you cast Lily on turn 4, her minus will be turned off because there won't be any creature cards in your graveyard, which means she's not really going to be a 4-drop walker who can protect herself. I think she's middling at best and is only viable in lower power cubes or cubes that are just starting out and are looking for some starter walkers. She's not going to make it in any tier 1 cubes. Please, Wizards, can you just please make us a good 4 mana black walker? Just saying, like, she's not going to do it. Last honorary mention in the black section is the card Rise Again. For 4 and a black, you get a sorcery, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and the only reason I bring this up are pauper players who are looking for another reanimate spell. 5 mana is a fine rate for reanimate in pauper or really, really low power environments, like retail draft style environments. But this effect can be hard to come by, and this is a new printing, so if you're supporting reanimate in a low power / pauper environment, you could give Rise Again a go. But let's move on to red and talk about Chandra, Heartfire. For 3 and double red, you get a legendary planeswalker Chandra with 5 loyalty. Discard your hand, +1, discard your hand, then exile the top 3 cards of your library. Until the end of turn, you may play cards exiled this way. +1, Chandra Heartfire deals 2 damage to any target. -9, search your graveyard and library for any number of red instant or sorcery cards, exile them, and then shuffle your library. You may cast them this turn, add 6 red. In regards to Chandra's +1 ability, Wizards is really fond of what I call impulsive draw in red. And what that means is that you drew these 3 cards, but you have to play them by the end of turn, and if you don't, you lose them. So you're not actually drawing cards, you're having to play them all as quickly as possible, because it's not like you can hold up a burn spell on your opponent's turn, the card's just locked in exile. I do like that both of Chandra's abilities are pluses. Chandra plussing to shock or plussing to draw cards is nice, so she's only ticking up. But she doesn't have a good way to protect herself from anything bigger than a 2/2. So Chandra's going to get popped by a lot of different things. And like I said, impulsive draw is not real draw. I think Chandra Heartfire doesn't cut it for me, especially when for 1 less mana I can get Chandra Torch of Defiance, who does all of the things that Chandra Heartfire does and more for less mana. And for 1 more mana, I can get Chandra Flamecaller or Chandra Awakened Inferno, both of whom represent a real end-of-game situation for your opponent if they're not answered. I don't think Chandra Heartfire does enough at 5 mana to threaten to end the game, nor does she provide the value of Chandra Torch of Defiance at 4 mana, so I think for me she's a miss. But if you're in a low-power environment, you could give her a go. Still, let's move on and see what else we can find in red that's super spicy, like, I don't know, Heartfire Emulator. This, boys and girls, is a decent red card. For 1 and a red, you get a 2/2 with Prowess. And then for red, you may sacrifice the Heartfire Emulator. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker. I love this card. I'm so excited about it. This, boys and girls, this is a quality red 2-drop. Your gut instinct is going to be to compare him to Goblin Cratermaker, and he's not quite as good as Goblin Cratermaker because of Cratermaker's ability to destroy colorless non-land permanents, i.e., Eldrazi and such. But Heartfire Emulator does have the option to hit planeswalkers, and that's not nothing. You can power him up, sling a bolt somewhere, maybe bolt your opponent's face, swing in, hit for 3, pay a red, sack him, deal 3 to the planeswalker. I've been playing Abbot of Carol Keep long enough to know how good Prowess is, but if you've played Abbot, you also know how often you cast him on turn 2 and can't do anything with the top card of your library. So most of the time, I think I'd prefer the Emulator because then at least I have the option of sacrificing him to shock a creature or planeswalker before he leaves the battlefield. This, I think, is going to be a slam dunk in almost every cube, and it's an uncommon, yes, budget cards. Probably the best red card in the set, quite frankly. Speaking of bad red cards, let's take a look at the Terror of the Peaks, which has been lighting up online discussion boards. For 3 and double red, you get a 5/4 dragon with flying. Spells your opponents cast that target Terror of the Peaks cost an additional 3 life to cast. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So Terror of the Peaks is fine, but he's not everything that everyone's making him out to be because he does just get popped by removal. And yes, your opponent has to bolt themselves to pop him, but they won't mind losing 3 life to kill this dragon. They won't. And at 5 mana, we've already got some great threats that have immediate impact, like Glorybringer, Thundermaw Hellkite, even Skargan Hellkite. They can come down with haste, and haste is huge. Swing in, get your damage now. Glorybringer has a lava coil attached to him, which is fantastic. So Terror of the Peaks is fine if you're in a low power environment, but I don't like him for regular tier 1, tier 0 cubes. He's not going to have any impact there. Speaking of low power environments though, if you're trying to do some low power sneak into play stuff, they're printing you Transmogrify. For 3 in a red, you get a sorcery, exile target creature. That creature's controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. That player puts that card onto the battlefield and then shuffles the rest of their library. Basically, a polymorph style effect. You know if you're looking for another one of these or not. The danger of Transmogrify, as with polymorph, is that you cast it to exile a creature, but the creature gets removed and then the spell fizzles. If exiling the creature was part of the casting cost, if Transmogrify said, as an additional cost to this spell, exile target creature, then it would be so much better and playable in higher tier cubes. But because you open yourself to get 2 for 1, it won't play in higher tier cubes, but you could play it in a tier 2 or tier 3 cube. There it could have a lot of success and be a lot of fun, and you combine it with Luca and polymorph itself, and suddenly that deck is really starting to come together. So if you're in that kind of environment, Transmogrify is for you. The other card that has really been lighting up the discussion boards online is Elder Gargaroth. So let's talk about him. For 3 in double green, you get a 6/6 beast with vigilance, trample, reach. Love those keywords. Whenever Elder Gargaroth attacks or blocks, choose one. Create a 3/3 green beast creature token, gain 3 life, or draw a card. I'm going to let you in on a secret, boys and girls. You are never going to pick gain 3 life. You're either going to make the beast or draw the card. The problem with Gargaroth is that he's in fact just a big 6/6 that does nothing the turn he enters the board. Let's just look at some quality green 4-drops, like Questing Beast that comes in with haste, death touch, and vigilance, can't be blocked by creatures power 2 or less, combat damage can't be prevented, and he can slap planeswalkers in addition to hitting players. And the premier green 4-drop, Thrun, with can't be countered, and hexproof, and regenerate. Both of these creatures grant value the moment they hit the board, and Thrun is really hard to remove even though he doesn't grant value. Elder Gargaroth, on the other hand, is a 6/6, and if you untap with him, he's going to be gross. More than likely, though, if he gets blown up, it's going to feel like a huge tempo blowout, and that's what brings us back to the conversation of Baneslayers in Cube. You know whether or not you want a Baneslayer in your green 5 slot. I don't. The green ramp deck has enough problems in life without playing his fatty only to have it be removed by a Doomblade. So Elder Gargaroth is not for me. If, however, you like big creatures that sit on the board, and if your opponent answers them, then great, they get to keep on living, but if they don't, then you win. I don't know. He's not for me, but you know if you want another Baneslayer. What's funny is, this card would have been gross 8 years ago in Magic. I bet Elder Gargaroth doesn't even see standard play. If you do want to pick one up, I encourage you not to do it this week, the week the set comes out. Wait a couple of weeks, it's not going to see standard play. It'll get substantially cheaper, especially with all the collector boosters people open. But let's talk about a green card that is worth really looking at, and that is new and improved Garrick. He's not cursed anymore. Garrick the Unleashed. For 2 in double green, you get a 4 loyalty Garrick, or Garuk, however you want to pronounce it. +1, up to 1 target creature gets +3/+3 and gains trample till the end of turn. -2, make a 3/3 green beast creature token. Then if your opponent controls more creatures than you, put a loyalty counter on Garuk or Garrick. -7, you get an emblem at the beginning of your end step. You may search your library for a creature card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. I like this card. I love the idea of playing a solid 3-drop like Lovestruck Beast, and then playing Garrick on 4 and plussing him and turning my Lovestruck Beast into a 8/8 with trample. Whoo boy! And even if I don't have a creature on the board, I can minus Garrick and make a 3/3 green beast, and then I'll have something to target and plus, and chances are if my board's empty, I won't even have to minus Garrick too, because I'll get to put a loyalty counter back on him. Odds are my opponent will have more creatures than me. How does this Garrick compare to the other 4-mana Garricks? Pretty well, actually. I think, as silly as this might sound, I think you play all the Garricks. Like, they're all so good, and they are doing what green mid-range decks want to do. As a matter of fact, if you want to play 5-mana Garrick Primal Hunter, I don't blame you for that either. Play the Garricks. Play all the Garricks. I like this one. I like the old ones. Play the Garricks. They look like a good time for me. The last card in green I want to talk about is one that I have had trouble trying to figure out, and that is the Lanoir Visionary. For 2 and a green, you get an Elf Druid 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card, and you may tap it for a green. So for those of you who've been around the block for a little while, you know that Wizards took the card Lanoir Elves and Elvish Visionary and smashed them together and created Lanoir Visionary. Here's the thing about this card. It seems both great and bad all at the same time. So let's talk about the ceiling. The ceiling on this card is turn 1, you play Lanoir Elves. Turn 2, you curve into Lanoir Visionary and you draw a card. And so then on turn 3, you untap, you've got 5 mana and an extra card in your hand. That seems pretty decent. The floor on this card is it's the only dork in your hand and you don't get to ramp until turn 3, in which case I think you probably need to be mulliganing. So, Lanoir Visionary is a 3-mana ramp spell. I don't like 3-mana ramp spells, but if you draw him late game, unlike Cultivate that's dead in your hand, you can play the Visionary and draw a card. I'm really conflicted about this Visionary, because my gut tells me I don't want to count him as a dork in my deck, because I have to wait until turn 3 to cast him unless I get help from a 1-drop. But drawing a card is so sweet, and the fact that he's not a dead draw late game, So here's where I've come down. If you're in a big cube, or you're in a low power cube, I think you play the Visionary. I think the upside of drawing a card is fine, and this might be the only 3-mana ramp spell that I think could be worth playing. When you compare him to drawing a card like Fertile Ground late, Lanoir Visionary is better because you get to draw a card and he replaces himself, whereas Fertile Ground, you're just like, yay, I drew a Fertile Ground and I don't need it. It's like drawing the wrong half of your deck. But in the early game without help, I think he's super slow. So, low power environments and cubes that are, say, 450 plus, yes. High power small cubes, maybe you don't have room for this guy because your density is so high at 1 mana. Maybe the Lanoir Visionary doesn't make it for you. Alright, now, it's that time, boys and girls. Let's talk about the great Jumpstart cards. Here we go! And we're done. Sweet. Good times. I'm glad. Good talk, guys. Good talk. Look, I combed the Jumpstart set up and down, and I just couldn't find anything that I thought was cubable outside of really low power environments / Pauper, stuff like that. So, this is also your Jumpstart video. Hope you enjoyed it. That's going to do it for today, Cubers. Let me know if you think I missed any cards in the comments below, or if you just have questions about specific cards that I didn't cover in the video and you want my thoughts on them, I'll do that for you too. Otherwise, be sure to like, subscribe, use the TCG Player affiliate link to buy all these new cards and help support the channel. You can catch me on Twitter at cubefortwo. You can find the Cube for Two and You podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify, all your major podcast outlets, not to mention that I also post a copy of it here on the channel if you're interested in the podcast also. Otherwise, until next time, shuffle up and keep cubing, my friends.